Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're located. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Serhiy Bilenky, and I'm a research associate at the Jacyk Center for Ukrainian Historical Research at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta. I welcome everyone to today's event, the roundtable titled The Battle for Ukraine's Past, sponsored by Petro Jacyk Program for the Study of Ukraine at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Toronto. Everybody's familiar with this ancient dictum that when the cannons are heard, the muses are silent, which refers probably to the near impossibility of the arts and deep reflection in general at times of war. But as historians of Ukraine, Russia, and Eastern Europe, we don't have a luxury to remain silent, at least not today and not in the future. Admittedly, not deep historical analysis of the current events in Ukraine is possible without necessary distance, chronological, intellectual, and even emotional. And yet, we can offer some raw thoughts and reflections on what is happening in Ukraine based on our expertise and professional training. And no other historians are better equipped to provide those thoughts and reflections than the ones who gathered today at this virtual roundtable. We have a few important themes or topics and questions to cover. Among them, how historians can talk about the current Russian-Ukrainian war. What is the role of the Russian historical mythology in the current war? What is the responsibility of intellectuals, if any? And for example, what kind of politics of memory, if any, is needed to prevent the Russian aggression in the future, let alone what's happening these days. Each participant today will have around 10 minutes to talk about his or her topic of interest. In the end, I hope we will have 10 to 15 minutes for the questions from the audience. Please ask the questions by using the Q&A section. I believe it's at the bottom of your Zoom screens. I will read the questions aloud for the participants, and I ask you, please, if you have questions, make them brief as possible and not lengthy comments, because we unfortunately will have a very limited time, about an hour until 4 p.m. Eastern time. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Dr. Lynne Viola, University Professor of History, University of Toronto, an award-winning historian of Stalinism and Soviet totalitarianism. Her latest monograph is Stalinist Perpetrators on Trial, Scenes from the Great Terror in Soviet Ukraine, published in 2017. Our second speaker is Dr. Koznarsky, Associate Professor at the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Toronto. He has published extensively on the city of Kyiv and its sacral and mythological functions within Ukrainian and also Russian cultures. Our third speaker is Dr. Oksana Dudko, Petro Jacyk Postdoctoral Fellow in Ukrainian Studies at St. Thomas More College in Saskatoon, University of Saskatchewan. She's a cultural historian of World War I and the revolutions in Eastern Europe. And our fourth speaker is Dr. Serhiy Yekelchyk, Professor of History and Germanic and Slavic Studies at the University of Victoria. He has published widely on Stalinism, but also on various aspects of modern Ukrainian history. His most recent book is Ukraine, What Everyone Needs to Know, published in 2020. Our speakers today will share the views on what is happening in Ukraine and whether or not Ukraine's past can explain the current war, Russian-Ukrainian war. And also how we, as scholars who are dealing primarily with the past, can talk about what is happening in front of our eyes right now. And one more thing before I give the floor to our speakers, please donate to Ukraine as much as you can. The link should be posted, I believe, in the chat. So check your chat and you will find all what you need to donate to Ukraine. And now I would like to invite Professor Viola to share her thoughts. Professor Viola, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Serhiy. And just to add one word about our chair, he is the author of an award-winning book on Kiev, and this is the right time to read it. It's one of the most beautiful books that I've read in the last 10 years. Serhiy posed several questions for us, and I decided I would try one, which is, should we as historians respond to Putin's vision of history? Is reputation needed? And I'll play, in a way, the devil's advocate. As a historian of modern Russia, I'm not sure we should respond to Putin's vision of history. His vision of history, if we can call it that, is little more than a veneer covering up the truth of the present, and that is a brutal war launched upon Ukraine by Russia. Moreover, this vision, so-called, is based on the most absurd versions of history, denying Ukraine's past and present, claiming neo-Nazis are in control of Kiev, and so on and so forth. Like most far-right ideologues, Putin seeks to use a distorted sense of the past to justify the present. His real aims, I think, are based less on historical visions and on some combination of revanchism, hatred against Ukraine, grievances against the West, and an arrogance cultivated by the lack of limits on his power and the conflation of his person with Russia's destiny. As we know, in 2005, Putin famously said, the collapse of the Soviet Union was, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, unquote. Well, he now aims to recapture at least some of what was lost. And this is revanchism of the sort that we saw in Hitler's Germany. How far he will go, we cannot say. The outcome is not decided. I suppose where history is most important is how we see the actions of the military. In some ways, he's playing a game of World War II, complete with blitzkrieg, although a failing blitzkrieg, and tank brigades and the bombings of cities, not to mention the attempts to revive the kinds of sentiments attached to the memory of World War II and to displace them onto this war. In a more fundamental way, though, he's repeating the military attacks on places like Grozny and Aleppo with total war as he destroys cities and civilian populations, leaving rubble and deaths. Do Russians share Putin's vision of history? Well, after 2014 and the occupation of Crimea, you may remember Russian intellectuals were more or less quiet, some even rejoicing at the acquisition of Crimea in their own nationalist interests. Now, though, something is different. First, to be clear, most Russians, some say 2/3, support Putin and the war. And we've read about the terrible phone calls home from people in Ukraine who have relatives in Russia and cannot convince them what is going on in Ukraine. So 2/3 is a lot, but that leaves 1/3 that seems to be opposed to the war. It's not an insignificant population. Over 15,000 Russians have been arrested for protesting. Virtually all of my colleagues in the historical profession are against the war. And needless to say, I can only speak for a small proportion of that profession. But most have responded using words like shock and more often shame. Some Russian professionals are leaving the country, but this remains a minority. So 1/3 is not nothing, but it's unlikely to move Putin. And that's mainly because he's resorted to a Stalinist historical practice, using, for example, preemptive measures of repression to suppress a supposed fifth column within Russia. In the last 10 years, Putin has decimated Russian civil society through the closure of institutions, the foreign agent law of 2012, and the arrest and harassment of dissidents. He has made a mockery of elections, engaged in military adventures leading to frozen conflicts in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria. He's closed down any remaining independent journalism, restricted the internet, liquidated such human rights organizations as Memorial, and pays an elite paramilitary forces good salaries, unusual to arrest protesters on the street and to guard him. He has an unholy alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church, resulting in traditionalist conservative posturing, homophobic policies, and the stoking of a xenophobic and anti-Western posture. You've heard these words from March 16th, but I want to read them because I think they're chilling. He said in a speech, any people, and particularly the Russian people, will always be able to tell the patriots from the scum and traitors and spit them out like a midge that accidentally flew into their mouth. I am convinced that this natural and necessary self-cleaning of society will only strengthen our country, our solidarity, cohesion, and readiness to meet any challenge. And of course, self-cleaning means purge. Interestingly enough, Stalin said something very similar in 1939 at the 18th Party Congress when the Great Purges, Great Terror, completed. He said, we're more united than ever. They weren't necessarily, and they're not now. So I wouldn't put the primary blame on Russian intellectuals. I place the blame squarely on Putin and his now very few trusted advisors. Make no mistake, Putin is not a historian, not even a revisionist historian. He's a revanchist, motivated by pent-up grievances against Ukraine and the West, and determined to cement his historical legacy, which so far isn't going too well for him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Viola. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Koznarsky. Please, Tarasa.
Thank you, Serhiy. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I perused the list of the questions and was trying to put together a couple of thoughts or connections from the questions that you put to the speakers. And I was thinking about the issues. Well, I'm not a historian, but I do work in cultural history, and therefore I do need to communicate with historians and Russian historians and Ukrainian historians. But as I was thinking about your question, can we communicate with Russian historians? Can there be a dialogue? That led me to the thinking what history is and what dimensions we are dealing with and will deal in the near and further future. Of course, there is history as intellectual enterprise of thinking, of analysis. And in this context, there are really good historians with whom such dialogue is possible and actually necessary. I'm just thinking about someone like Tairova Yakovleva in Petersburg. I would absolutely want to continue conversations with historians of her caliber and her mindset, that's for sure. Then, of course, there is history as public and political industry that goes into curricula, and very much will depend how much history as an intellectual enterprise can affect the shapings of that industry that then goes into classrooms that then ends up disseminated to large groups of population, affecting their views, affecting their behavior. So it will be historians and academics' task to participate and affect that the public discourse of history remains open and objective, and that will be another dimension of engagement with history, whether there is a possibility of that. And then the third dimension of this is more universal. And it becomes more and more important in the current days as we are dealing with the effects of disinformation and brainwashing, which includes history as part of its quote unquote arguments. And I think the direction and the possibility of any dialogue will depend on the aspect of outright information security, the ability to convey thinking ideas without being limited or distorted by media that were cultivated purposefully by authoritarian regimes. So informational security will be critical there. And then the fourth dimension is the dimension of popular culture, popular imagination, even imagology. There is such a discipline which kept me thinking, so what will happen now? Like Ukrainians from 18th century onwards lived and operated with navigated the curse of Mazepa, as I've called it, but it's true, the curse of this implicit sort of Chachol, the traitor of Peter the Great, of Muscovy, of the Russian Empire, that has various iterations throughout historical epochs, periods in the 19th century, the 20th century. What now? It's about the memory and articulations of historical, past historical encounter and historical trauma. Will there be a curse of Putin now placed on the perception of Russian society? I don't know, but it is traumatic. The encounter has been traumatic. And again, it will be the role of historians to untangle this and see how this encounter and this experience influence behaviors, statements, products that were created over the past 200, 300 years in the field that often was shared, the field of the Russian Empire. And again, it brought me back to the 19th century, where some of these ideas that are instrumentalized today were articulated and tested out. The idea of Ruski Mir comes down to the 19th century official Russian nationality and the vision of nationality, like orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. And that nationality was eventually shaped as Pan-Russian, that is Orthodox Slavic. And these claims, of course, substantiated the vision of Russian Empire and its nationalization, roughly from 1830s onwards. And we also have to say that Ukrainians participated in these processes in various ways. They negotiated, they navigated, they participated in the empire. And again, it's not something that should be bleached. It's part of how groups behave in structures such as Russian Empire. And there were various various strategies and various legacies. There is even in the 19th century and onwards, we'll have to revisit the notion of naming and names. What is Rus, how it was perceived versus Russia? How did Ukrainians laid their claims to that Rus legacy or history? And it could be quite interesting and complex, but it should not be simplified. It's interesting to see how terms such as Little Russia, Ukraine, and Southern Rus were strategically used depending on a situation and a context in which they were used by Ukrainian participants and Russian participants. Some of it might be a little bit uncomfortable. We'll be talking about aspects of loyalism as performance in that period. And again, there are numerous nuances that allow us to discern performance and performance, or look at texts such as Historia Rusov that could be read as more or less loyalist, or could be read by a Ukrainian reader as a revolutionary text, pretty much urging to fight the invader. There is such a response from at least one participant in Cyril and Methodius's brotherhoods, Andruski, who claimed to, I'll take up weapons to fight the Muscovites on my land. On my land, he said, not on their territory, on mine. That is 1847. The impact of cumbersome, rather political tract written in Russian, Istoria Rusov. So the sources, the nature of Ukrainian discourse, and it's not just in Ukrainian, will need to be reassessed. But one thing is clear, that the respect of culture, respect of language will have to be there. And that respect was lacking over the past decades, sort of dismissing, there is no language, there is no, it's part of Putin's agenda, and that will have to be revisited. As to behaviors, again, sometimes it's looking back at history, you start thinking, okay, how did, if it's true, you know, the Chancellor Kochubey, the most little Russian of Ukrainian high-placed bureaucrats in the Russian Empire of the early 19th century. Yet, if it is true, what a German visitor noticed, that in his own villa, he had a portrait of Mazepa. How did Halahan's descendants, the descendants of a colonel who betrayed Zaporozhian siege to its downfall in 1709, became the great sponsor of Ukrainian activities and culture in the 19th century? How did Pavlo Skoropadsky, the descendant of Ivan, the last hetman under Peter, manage to shape his vision of Ukrainian independence after the collapse of the Russian Empire? These are some of the paths that are absolutely fascinating, and we can puzzle, but there is certain fabric of logic in these outcomes, in these unexpected twists. But back to language and culture, and we see how language and culture gets instrumentalized or even weaponized. We can, my most recent experiences are the most bizarre, strange experiences when I end up teaching a course on cultural history of Kiev this semester. I could have never thought I'll be teaching it against the background of this war. And you know, reading Bulgakov and reading Podmohylny also helps me understand, and I hope my students as well, the significance of dignity of language and culture, and how important it is for the, because it's a process of inhabiting, of coding a space in which people live and operate. Again, I won't go into contemporary aspects, but for Kiev, Kiev as Russian Jerusalem, of course, the cliche, the reason why Russia has to have the cradle of the three brotherly people, the Soviet cliche, that of course lingers in the minds of those geopolitical strategists sitting here and there in, you know, Valdai Club or whatever you call it. But one thing teaching this course struck in my mind, because you look at Kiev, the capital of Rus, multi-tribal polity ruled by Varangians, and the name Rus initially in the primary chronicle is precisely that, a Varangian retinue, a Viking army. But Kiev, in its golden period around 10th, 11th century, the city supposedly of 50,000 inhabitants and 400 churches. So the first downfall of Kiev from its, and the most massive of its golden age, is 1240, the Mongol yoke, the attack of tremendous Mongol horde that besieged and devastated, that has decimated the city. From 40 to 50,000 to 4 to 5,000, it was decimated, and it never recovered until the 19th century in terms of pure demographic. After that, there were several attacks of the Tatars. Until 1917, when the Bolshevik army with Antonov, Ovseyenko, and Muravyev purposefully decided to inflict destruction upon the city with artillery. There was no other example of that type of massive, massive or not massive, but purposeful destruction of the city. Mongols and then the Bolsheviks in 1917. Neither Petlura nor the Whites did not intend to ruin the city. The ruinous words appear in the directives of Muravyov. The third massive ruin occurred in 1941 during German Nazi occupation of Kiev, but it was not done by the Nazis. It was done by the Soviet underground KGB that blasted the center of Kiev. We can understand scorched earth policy to destroy. And when I was growing up in Soviet Union, we were taught, oh, Germans did that to Kiev. And I didn't have a chance to question it until much later. And then reading recent histories, reading Kuznetsov's Babi Yar, it makes no sense that Germans would have destroyed the city they comfortably finally grabbed and settled up in. So Germans did not have a reason to blast Kiev in 1941. They might have had reasons later when they were retreating, as they had reasons for Warsaw and for Prague, but not in 1941. Not only did Bolsheviks destroy the center of Kiev, they destroyed Kiev Cave Monastery. Again, scorched earth policy, but also the policy that many suggest was meant to initiate the violence between the occupiers, the Nazis, and the public and the population in Kiev, speeding up the devastating violence and brutality of Holocaust of Babi Yar. And now we are talking in one more time, 2021, the devastation, the purposeful destruction of the city, whatever they call it, or whatever it is being called, Russian Jerusalem, or the mother of Russian cities, or Rus cities, but again, we see that moment where the claimant to the ownership, to the legacy of the Kiev is the destroyer of the city. And it's absolutely devastating. And but I hope that we can talk with historians. We have to talk with historians, and we have to untangle this mess, curses and everything, Ukry, Orki, Rashisty, Banderovцы. It's
well, it's a big task for historians, but I guess
yes, and it will be on every possible level, going for the public history, going for information and information security, and maintaining this ability to speak and listen. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Koznarsky. It was actually, that's a great topic to uncover, and the role of Kiev in all of this. And unfortunately, we see that, well, I can't comment on it at this point. I would ask now Dr. Oksana Dudko, please, to share your thoughts about all these issues.
Yeah, thank you so much. Before the roundtable, the organizers kindly sent a list of questions to consider. So, like other panelists, I'll try to answer a few of them today. One of the questions was whether Russia's invasion of Ukraine has anything to do with history. From my perspective, this war is so violent and so difficult to end precisely because it's all about history and Russia's desire to change the future of Ukraine and Europe according to its understanding of historical development. Putin's obsession with history is actually quite remarkable. So at the same time that he was preparing to invade Ukraine, Putin attempted to position himself not only as a great Russian leader, but also as a great historian. He did this by writing and delivering historical lectures in which he basically he justified the invasion. Specifically in his article, which I'm sure you know, on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which he published in July 2021, Putin denied Ukrainian sovereignty and stated that Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians are one people. So in this article, he stated the following, I quote, "I said that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, a single whole. I would like to emphasize that the wall that has emerged in recent years between Russia and Ukraine, between the parts of what is essentially the same historical and spiritual space, to my mind, is our great common misfortune and tragedy. End of quote. So in Putin's historical imagination, this idea of one people is rooted, as Professor Koznarsky mentioned, in the Middle Ages and in the history of the medieval East Slavic polity, Kievan or Kievan in Russian, Rus. The second historical event that plays an enormously important role in Putin's vision of history is the Pereyaslav Treaty of 1654, and actually the whole period of the Cossack Hetmanate and the Russian Empire in general. In Russia's official historical discourse, the Pereyaslav Treaty between the Cossack Hetmanate and Russia against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth represented a so-called reunification of Russia and Ukraine. Moreover, official Russian discourse interprets this treaty as evidence that Ukrainians always had a strong desire to unify with Mother Russia. The statement about the Pereyaslav Treaty as a reunification of Ukraine and Russia proliferated into all kinds of official and social Russian discourse. So when I was recently browsing on Instagram, which along with TikTok is becoming a significant historical archive of the current war, in my opinion. So I was not even surprised that the Russian Foreign Ministry has shared a post that celebrates the Pereyaslav Treaty and the so-called reunification of Russia and Ukraine as one of the major events of Russian history. This unity discourse is only part of the story. The other part is Putin's desire to downplay Ukrainian sovereignty and statehood. To do so, Putin uses rhetorical Russian imperial tropes and portray Ukraine as a question that should be solved or as a foreign intrigue. At the turn of the 20th century, the Ukrainian national movement was framed by Russian imperial authorities as a German invention and German intrigue. Putin uses similar justification to emphasize the superficial nature of Ukraine as a sovereign state. On the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin delivered, as you know, his historical lecture in which he recycled these old Russian imperial claims that denied Ukrainian sovereignty and stated that Ukraine was Lenin's invention. These claims about the artificiality of Ukraine as a state also appear in the current official Russian discourse, in which Ukraine is portrayed as a Western intrigue, the country that has been manipulated by the West and NATO to destroy Russia. That said, I think the West made a major miscalculation that they treated the aggressive build-up of Russian troops at the Ukrainian border and the invasion in pragmatic and strategic terms. Although economy, politics, and geopolitics do matter in the current war, Russia's war is not shaped by them. Instead, I believe that Russia's and Putin's imperial fantasies, which are based on a distorted understanding of history, play an enormously important role in the current conflict. And finally, I would like to briefly tackle the question on how a historian can talk about the Russian-Ukrainian war. I think that many historians feel more comfortable talking about dead people, so to speak. We are used to analyzing what had already happened, not making predictions about the future. So it's a challenge for historians to figure out how to talk about the current war. And it's even more difficult for historians of Ukraine and Ukrainian historians who have a deep intimate and personal connection to Ukraine. However, I think that it is important to move beyond presenting the current war in a Marvel Comics style narrative. It is very convenient to see this war as the master plan of a villain, namely Putin, that and limits scholarly analysis to his actions. Portraying the war as the actions of one mad person is highly disturbing. I think that historians must use the powerful methodological toolkit that have developed while studying the Holocaust, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and Western imperialism to understand the wide popular support of the war in Russian society. Although Western scholars tend to view the Russian people as victims of Putin's regime, it is important to remember that many people in Russia do not see themselves as victims of Putin's authoritarian regime and fully support the state politics. It is important to understand why they do so. And finally, discussing Russia's war in Ukraine, it is also important to shift our focus from Russia to Ukraine and other Eastern European countries. In doing so, it's critical to carefully think the recent scholarship of nationalism in Eastern Europe, which is limited to the scholarly obsession with radical nationalism and far-right groups. I think it's important to provide a more nuanced understanding of nationalism, national identity, patriotism, and anti-imperial movements in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. Thank you very much. And I will ask Professor Yekelchyk, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I would like to start by making a remark about the politics of memory in Ukraine being treated in a certain way in Western scholarship and suggest the proper context for treating it. I think looking back at the past 2 decades, there was indeed, as Oksana has just mentioned, an obsession with finding as many as possible traits in Ukraine of the radical right or neo-Nazi groups, including among the historians. And as we now realize, this particular obsession played into an important trend in the propaganda conducted by the Russian media in Europe as well. Fairly successfully, because it targeted this area which by default was important for the leftist circles in the West and such, not realizing perhaps that Mr. Putin was not a socialist conducting work against capitalism. So the suggestion I'm going to start with is rather obvious to me, but I wonder how often we have seen it implemented. And this is the fact that the Ukrainian politics of memory has developed from the very start in a dialogue with something. First, with a Soviet historical schema, which was fairly well known to everybody, because everybody was studying using the Soviet curriculum and school textbooks. So that was the initial dialogue, an attempt to slowly decenter and eventually displace the Soviet historical mythologies. But almost as soon as this attempt unfolded, the Ukrainian historians and public intellectuals also became involved in a dialogue with a developing Russian national mythology. And that dialogue actually was a true dialogue in that it was not just the Ukrainians who were responding to the Russian mythology, but also, in fact, the Russian state was responding to new Ukrainian historical ideas and historical memory. So it elicited response. It was, in fact, one of those memory wars in Europe, which now become a very popular topic, especially in European scholarship. But I do think that in the Ukrainian case, the study of this process needs to be more subtle, kind of more sensitive to what, in fact, was happening with Ukraine during the Soviet and Russian imperial period. And in this respect, it may well be that the very well-known policies of decommunization pursued since 2015 in Ukraine were strategically right, but tactically misnamed. Because when pursuing them, the Ukrainian public intellectuals who are trying to react to the Russian aggression, and perhaps more importantly, to react in more immediate short term to one particular Russian legislation, which criminalized any attempts to undermine the Russian theory of what the Great Patriotic War was. That was the immediate context of decommunization legislation, which I don't see mentioned very often in the discussions of decommunization in the West. So the immediate response was, in fact, it was an immediate response to recently introduced Russian policies, Russian legislation. But secondly, I think it went for the ideological bent, thinking that for the global audience, it would be easier to understand it, to accept it, in parallel with denazification. So that Nazi ideology and symbols would be outlawed, and the Soviet Bolshevik ideology and symbols would be then perceived as parallel process. And that did not quite happen. And I think by now, many of us working in the field of Ukrainian history realize that there was a more powerful medium, the medium which would have resonated much better, and which now resonates much better with the Western audiences, and that would be decolonization, something which my Canadian students immediately understand as a reference. So Mr. Putin was not a member of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He didn't care about the ideology of communism. He was, in fact, and remains today, an anti-communist. So the only thing he truly likes about the Soviet Union is the great power status and the nuclear powers. He likes Stalin, really, not Lenin, which is the reason why Lenin gets blamed for everything, including the creation of Ukraine, which is, of course, ridiculous. But nevertheless, I think my point is here that only now, after this invasion of the Russian army, which transformed the long-lasting war into an all-out conflict and a massive war, which threatens to envelop millions and millions of people beyond the Ukrainian borders as well. Only now the Ukrainian parliament finally started discussing the decolonization drive. And of course, it was all about the Russian Tsars and Tsarinas, about the prohibitions of Ukrainian culture, about the World War I and the way it played on the Eastern Front. And of course, in World War I, the suppression of the Ukrainian movement was one of the principal aims of the Russian Empire. So it had to be from the very start decolonization. And it also had to deal with the issues that form the core of Ukrainian identity. The politics of memory from the very start defined the new Ukrainian identity. Right now, we see the marvelous Ukrainian resistance in this war indicates the presence of a strong Ukrainian identity, which obviously relies on a system of beliefs. You can call them national mythology, you can call them anti-imperial resistance in the field of knowledge and spirit, but they do present an important kernel of Ukrainian identity now. So how did this happen? If we limit all our research on Ukrainian historical memory to decommunization, we would not arrive to that answer. In order to arrive to that answer, we need to head all the way back into the early 1990s, when the first school textbook, which revolutionized 20th century history for Ukrainian children, for Ukrainian school students, by Professor Fedor Turchenko, for the first time, introduced the notion of the OUN and UPA as a second trend in Ukrainian resistance during World War II. And it was in the same period when the very concept of the Great Patriotic War started being undermined in Ukrainian historical narratives. And the Ukrainian People's Republic from 1918 came back as well, big time. And so when this work started, an important divergence developed between the Russian and Ukrainian historical memory and memory politics. And that was the most important thing we see now sociologically when trying to evaluate why Ukrainian and Russian attitudes right now are so different and why Ukrainians are putting up such a resistance. And that is the attitude to the Soviet experience writ large. Sociologically, it usually measured on the question of your attitude to Stalin and Stalinism. And in Russia, of course, Stalin still gets very high marks as an important statesman, as the great leader, unless Mr. Putin is included in the poll, in which case Mr. Putin beats even Stalin, but not without Putin, right? So, and in the Ukrainian case, it is overwhelmingly clear that the majority of Ukrainians, for a significant period of time now, consider Stalin to be a bloodthirsty tyrant, a person who basically killed Ukrainians rather than advanced historical development of the nation. And this difference was established already in the 1990s, early on, particularly with the notions not of the UNOPA, but of the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine. It took some significant time. It was only towards the end of Viktor Yushchenko's presidency, at about 2008, 2009, that sociological surveys started demonstrating that Ukrainians believed that the Holodomor was the greatest catastrophe of the Ukrainian nation, that it was a crime, a genocide committed by the Soviet authorities. And with this, the new concept developed, a very powerful one, because it included, as you realize, you can build any number of beautiful monuments, but monuments only work when there is a widely accepted social and cultural rituals conducted around them. And so when this marching with candles, the so-called Hoda Holodomoru in Ukrainian, marching with candles in November became a national tradition, displaying a candle in your window became a national tradition. That was the moment when Mr. Putin should have realized no invasion would work. It would just simply not work. And so the Holodomor became enormously central for Ukrainian identity. But another concept added to it became just as powerful. And with this concept of Europe, I have to say that I was guilty, as well as many Western historians, when discussing the Ukrainian school textbooks and Ukrainian historical concepts, I was guilty of saying, but you idealize Europe, it's a myth. Europe is not at all like that. So it is actually a misleading concept. But then, of course, when the war happened, I realized that, yes, I was right and I was wrong at the same time, and all of us were. Europe was being used in the Ukrainian historical discourse as a metaphor, as a stand-in for something really important, which otherwise you would have to explain in several sentences: the rule of law, the struggle against corruption, equal economic opportunity, democracy, all kinds of things. Prosperity too. Prosperity is important, right? So very few Ukrainians had real life experience with the bureaucratic structures of the European Union, but the reason why two Ukrainian revolutions were fought under the slogan of returning to Europe or joining Europe is precisely that this metaphor fit very nicely into the social and cultural expectations of Ukrainians. So it was then a myth and a metaphor, but it became a powerful one. And of course, guilty as I was, I now realize that there's a point that should have been made there of Europe not living up to its brilliance as a metaphor. And it's only now, I think, only in recent weeks, when Europe and the world realize that Ukraine will resist and will resist strongly and will not be defeated. And Europe is finally making attempts to rise to what it was, what its image always was for Ukrainians in recent decades. I could stop there, or I could actually make one more proposal very briefly, and then perhaps elaborate on it during the discussion if you are interested. So we read a lot about Bandera and Banderites becoming heroes in Ukraine, and this allegedly confirming Russia's accusations of Ukraine being a neo-Nazi state or something. A ton of this scholarship. Very few scholars, however, would ask the question, so why it is Bandera who is suddenly so prominent on Ukrainian streets, and not Petro, and not Mazepa? Like the real question, I think, why not Mazepa? So those of us who study Ukrainian history both in the 19th and the 20th century, the interaction between Ukraine and the Russian Empire, would realize at once. The answer is very clear, because the Russian propaganda focuses on Bandera. Because it's the same dialogue in which the Ukrainian authorities were really locked for a significant period of time. And I'm not saying it's a good thing, actually. I have another argument about what kind of a dialogue is more productive than this one. But it's true that for as long as the Russian Empire denounced Mazepists, the Ukrainians were taking up the Cossack glory. And for as long as Stalin denounced Petlurites, which basically historically about until 1944, starting in 1945, and beyond that you already start getting Banderites. 1944, when Stalin criticizes Dovzhenko, he still says, you are a Petlurite. So which is true, because Dovzhenko actually served in Petlura's army, right? So not that Stalin necessarily knew it, maybe suspected. So it is actually a response to your former imperial master pounding you with propaganda focused along this particular line. And that is the reason why Bandera, a highly mythologized Bandera, is re-emerging in Ukrainian public discourse as a symbol. This is the reason also for Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava becoming a totally acceptable slogan, even so there were early on voices about this is a Nazi slogan, this is neo-Nazi slogan. All of us had to explain this point. Well, that's the same. That is the clearest available, most powerful symbol, which is perceived as anti-Russian, anti-imperial. And the fact that Bandera is in this place, it's actually the responsibility of Mr. Putin's propaganda. And I can talk more about, but I know,
yes.
I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Yekelchyk. Unfortunately, we have probably around 15 minutes left for our discussion today. And we have two questions already in Q&A. And I propose we probably should, if you don't mind, we can try to discuss these two questions. And the first question is from John Stanley. And the question might be somewhat linked to what Professor Yekelchyk spoke about Bandera, the image of Bandera in Ukraine. And the question is, how is the role of Poland and Poles in the history of Ukraine changing under the pressure of Putin's war in Ukraine? So it's about Poland, but it's probably more than that. So if someone wants to reflect on this question with a reasonable time framework, so.
I think it fits right in with this European notion. I think in history textbooks and academic monographs as well, we now see more emphasis on Ukraine's European experience, the experience which involved some kind of social contract, an understanding on the part of the king that the king needs to guarantee the rights of his subjects. And this is what Polish history is for us now, not to mention the elements of Renaissance, completely lacking in Russian history, and all these things which can be seen as portraying Ukraine as part of the West.
If I might to add to this a couple of sentences, I'm not equipped to speak about this question in detail, but if I understand it correctly, the question also includes the side that addresses the recent trend in Polish history, especially history connected with politics, Polish politics of memory, that had particular spin on or particular direction and attitude toward what happened in Ukraine in the mid-20th century. And it's a very complex historical issue that I'm not in position to discuss. But what I can probably say that the very experience of refugees, the very mobilization of Ukrainian society and Polish society, and realizing the common aim to save lives and to repel the invader could be a path toward, again, call it humanizing, toward understanding that will help detangle the tragedy of the mid-20th century, which is very, very powerful. It's very traumatic. So it might be the spin that our the colleague who asked the question was trying to get at, but again, I could only answer it very generically and in a preliminary way.
Thank you. We have actually more questions, so perhaps we can go to the second one. It's Daniel Healy. Many of us Soviet historians essentially trained as Russianists, readers and speakers of the Soviet lingua franca and interpreters of the Soviet narrative of modern Eurasia. How do we begin to decolonize our approach as Soviet historians? It's a great question to our own professional unconsciousness training. Okay. I'm not trained as a Soviet historian, so I can't speak for them.
Well, I can say something, but I mean, this is a similar question that I've been puzzling with. And there have been attempts to suggest a kind of decolonization without using those words. If you look at, for example, Adib Khalid's work on Central Asia, and the point of the vantage point that one must look at things. But it seems to me that this is a question that Ukrainianists have been talking about, but Russianists haven't. And my small cure is just to say I am a Russianist. I'm not a historian of the Soviet Union. So when I taught my class, it was Soviet Russia. I might, I'd make excursions into Ukrainian history, but I'd make that clear. But I do think this is a discussion that needs to be held in the field, and certainly with a healthy participation of Russianists. But I'd be very curious to see what my historian colleague, Serhiy or Oksana, thinks about this question, because I think it's very important, at least from the perspective of the field at this point.
Very quickly, I think it would need to spread to other fields too. As a person in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies, I think in Russian cultural history, and those of us who teach Russian and Soviet culture really need to think it through big time. The connection between the empire and the notion of a great culture. But secondly, the most important and most perhaps difficult thing in decolonization of Soviet history or Russian history is the issue of agency. And I think the field has been struggling for a long time with the issue of agency, with Lynne making major contributions on the agency of the peasants, for instance, in the Soviet Union, right? And I thought it was an excellent entry point for us to understand too, because the Ukrainianists are very often specialists on the national elites, and it's fashionable actually in Ukraine to talk about national elites and their role in history. But searching for resistance in everydayness during any period in Russian imperial and Soviet history, and it is in the process of this everyday resistance that identity is being defined and vice versa, I think the most complex issue we are going to face. And we really need the support of those people who have been trained as Russianists, precisely.
If I may add to this, oh, sorry, Oksana, I'll let you speak first.
After you.
I also wanted to add to what Serhiy just said, that one of the litmus tests, perhaps, of a Sovietologist or Soviet historian or Russian historian to opening up to the dialogue could be, from what I've experienced over the past years, the reaction or attitude toward Holodomor. And it's not uncommon to find dismissive attitudes, that it's still some kind of, I know the politics of Holodomor, it's different from studies of Holodomor, but there is still that kind of Soviet residue of dismissing of the entire thing as irrelevant to the notions of imperialism, genocide, and hunger and power. So that will be my quick addition to Serhiy's comments.
I just want to quickly jump in, and I want to answer in more practical terms, because historians have long been argued for nuanced understanding of the Soviet Union and Soviet history. However, I think that this nuanced understanding of history that is actually presented in recent research is not translated and is not that visible in the Soviet Union survey courses. So when I think about the decolonization of history, I think about teaching. I think about teaching, and I think about syllabi. I still believe they still have two biases. Or first of all, it's Russia-centric, still Russia-centric, and secondly, it's a very top-down perspective. So I think, like, it is including of the so-called transnational, if you wish, understanding of the Soviet history, including other republics, but not only other Soviet republics, but other Russian regions into the story, and providing sources from different parts of the Soviet Union, I think could be a first practical step in teaching the Soviet history differently. I really, when I taught the Soviet Union course 1 year, my objective was very simple and kind of plain. I just wanted my students know at least one fact about each Soviet republic and about other regions of the Soviet Union. So this is just some initial thoughts about this. Thank you.
Thank you for the answers. I think we have time for one or two more. The question from Donald Schwartz is about actual Donbass, and I'll try to rephrase it in maybe slightly. The question is: would you comment on today's reported Russia's announcement that its main focus is now on liberating Donbass? So the question is perhaps for all of us: what's the relevance of Donbass in all this? Because we discussed why Kyiv is important, and Professor Koznarsky showed convincingly why Kyiv is important for Russia. Why Donbass? Is it simply a ploy? What's what you think about? I mean, in Putin's kind of, again, this kind of slightly crazy historical imagination.
Well, because it was a pretext for the war itself, actually. The war started in the Donbass, and the most recent invasion started, the all-out invasion started with claims of a genocide in the Donbass. Beyond that, the Donbass is the most kind of Soviet region in the mythology that exists in Russia. It's the imaginary land of the miners who heroically toil to provide coal for the motherland, which of course is completely untrue. And of course, on the Russian part of the Donbass, and there is actually the Russian part of the Donbass on the Russian border, because this geographical economic region extends beyond the borders of Ukraine. On the Russian side, all the mines have been closed long ago, and all the miners have been fired and whatever. But on the Ukrainian side, it remains in the Russian imagination, the mythological land of heroic Soviet people toiling for the motherland.
I think we probably have to wrap up our discussion. We already passed 5 minutes past. In the end, I just want to quote something that I just read on Facebook, and this is from our Ukrainian colleague. She's a historian, and I quote: "In Ukrainian cities under Russian occupation, soldiers are destroying history books right now. So history matters, end of quote. And I think it's a sad reality. I guess as a historian, I don't want history to matter this way. Obviously, I want history to become irrelevant. But we have to deal with the reality. And thank you, our speakers, for this excellent thoughts and reflections. In the beginning, I said that we're not able to come up with deep reflections, but your reflections were deep and relevant and very interesting. So thank you again for your participation. Thank you, audience, for being such an active audience in these challenging times. Please donate to Ukraine via the link still probably posted in the chat. Ukraine needs your donations, and have a safe evening, whether you're located in North America or especially in Ukraine. Thank you, and hopefully see you in this next events organized by series. Thank you.
Thank you.